It's Loki Wednesday again. Today we have episode 2 entitled The Variant. Like last week, I'm going to just talk about my spoiler thoughts. I'm not going to get too much into the details of every single thing that happened in this episode, mostly just the big things. But if you haven't watched this episode yet, go watch it on Disney Plus and then come back here because, again, you do not want any of this spoiled. This was a very crazy episode. Let's get right into it. So this one starts off with another team of Minutemen being attacked by the variant Loki, the evil variant Loki. And this time, instead of just taking the charge, the reset charge, they also take someone hostage, which is interesting. So Loki, Mobius, by the way, I was calling him Morbius last week, like the vampire villain. I didn't mean that. I meant Mobius, but anywho. So Mobius, Loki, and some of the Minutemen go to the scene and try to figure out what happened. The purpose of Loki being there is to give his perspective as someone who is Loki, right? And what the variant might do. So he kind of tries to use that to his advantage and trick the Minutemen and Mobius and catch them in a trap, which we learn later on. But you kind of see it in this moment too. And he does this whole speech about what Loki would do and them walking outside of the tent would be a trap in itself and all this other stuff. And then Mobius is like, nah, he's just messing with us. Let's keep going. And that I thought was a funny moment. Overall, I think the show has more of a buddy cop feel than Falcon and Winter Soldier did. Like, this feels like a sci-fi procedural where we have like the experienced detective and then the new guy who kind of gets dragged along and everybody's not very confident in the new guy. It has a lot of those same things that you've kind of seen in other similar shows, sort of like Gotham in a way, or some other like CSI kind of stuff. Like, that's the feel I get from the show, but it's with Marvel and time travel and crazy sci-fi stuff. So in this episode, we also get a lot of moments with Loki and Mobius having some really long discussions about just the meaning of life, what time means in this place where time is almost non-existent in a way, you know, because the TVA exists out of the reality that we've known up to this point. But there is some interesting moments where Loki discovers that Asgard was destroyed while he's looking through some files, which is another big realization. You see tears welling up in his eyes, and so it is a moment that hits you in the feels. But then he has this epiphany that, wait a minute, if someone were to hide in this apocalypse before it happens, everything they did there before the apocalypse happens would basically not be detectable because as an apocalypse, everything they do is going to be wiped out anyway. So that's why they figure out that the Loki variant is actually hiding in an apocalypse, but they don't know which one yet, so they have to do some research. The only clue they have is the gum that the little child from the last episode gave Mobius, and so they use that, cross-reference it, and figure out that there's this big warehouse store in the middle of this apocalypse in 2050, I believe, and that's where they go. But before that, there is a moment that's really fun where they do an experiment to test out Loki's theory. They go to Pompeii before the volcano erupts, and Loki just causes havoc. He lets some animals free. He gives this whole speech to the people like, I'm from the future, you're all gonna die, blah, blah, blah. And Mobius like, what are you doing? What are you doing? But then Mobius realizes that the timeline is not being changed by any of Loki's actions, which proves his theory true. So that's where they confirm that the apocalypse is definitely where this Loki is hiding. There's also some good moments with Mobius and some of the other members of the TVA. You can tell like everybody else, even Mobius to a degree, does not trust Loki at all. There's a moment where Mobius hands him some knives as they're about to head out on the mission, and then I think the agent, I forgot her name, but I think it's like B-15. I could be wrong. I'm just going to put it here if I can't remember it. But I remember she like sees him give Loki knives and she's like, no. And she takes them back, which is really funny. And by the end of this episode, you realize they are kind of right because Loki does have ulterior motives. But up to that point, though, it's still kind of like very on the fence. Like, is Loki trying to actually do the right thing or does he have some other purpose? Because you do see in multiple moments during this episode, Loki asks about meeting the Time Masters. Every time Mobius tries to make a deal with him, he's like, oh, wait, does this mean I get to meet the Time Masters? Or the Timekeepers? I keep calling them Time Masters, I guess because of Legends of Tomorrow. But the Timekeepers, do I get to meet the Timekeepers if I do this? And so you can tell that's something that he's kind of aiming towards, but you still don't really get the full idea of it yet until the end of the episode. Also, going off the apocalypse thing, it was also funny where Loki tried to do this metaphor with Mobius's salad. He took the salad and he started pouring all stuff in, like, if I do this and this, like salt, pepper, and then he goes to that guy from the last episode. I also forgot his name. I'm really bad with names right now. But the guy from the last episode, he takes his milk, it looked like milk, and pours it into the salad. And I felt bad for Mobius because, you know, that's his lunch. But it was a funny moment. But I did think it was a good metaphor. It, like, worked for what he was explaining. So let's fast forward to the end of this episode. So they find the variant is hiding in this, like, big Walmart-like store during this apocalypse around 2050, which is actually kind of scary. Because, like, I'm kind of like, that's kind of around the time they're predicting the world might end because of, like, climate change and stuff. So that's kind of weird. I hope Marvel's not right with that prediction. But anywho, they find that there's a bunch of people hiding out there, but they're looking around trying to figure out where this Loki is. And so Loki ends up going with one of the Minutemen, and Mobius is with the rest of the group. But Loki runs into the other version of himself. And also, I forgot to mention earlier in this episode, we discovered that this other Loki has the ability to control people. And that's something they use a lot in this next scene, where he's talking to the other Loki as the other Loki is jumping from person to person, and then eventually gets to this big guy who they end up fighting. But that's a really cool thing, and kind of get an idea of what this Loki's motivation is. This other one, Loki, our Loki, we learned that his goal ultimately is to try and overthrow the Timekeepers. And he wanted to recruit the other Loki as his lieutenant. But the other Loki's like, nah, that's not what I want to do. So you can tell that this Loki has their own motives. And we do get a reveal at this episode that the other Loki is in fact, well, I guess it is woman, Lady Loki is what they're calling, but I know technically Loki is gender fluid, so you can't really say that this is a lady version of Loki. It's just Loki. But just for the sake of being able to tell the two apart, when I'm talking about, I'll say Lady Loki and then our Loki, okay? But Lady Loki reveals herself and says, it's not about you. And we finally see what her big plan is. We see that she's been going around beating up Minutemen and then stealing their reset charges. So we see that she has them set up all across the store, and it turns out her plan was to essentially bomb the timeline. So as she's escaping, she sets off the timer, and this causes all of the reset charges to get sucked into the timeline, I guess that's what happened. And it causes huge explosion of branches off the timeline. So I think this is actually the beginning of the multiverse of madness. Literally, it's creating the multiverse that the Timekeepers and TVA were talking about, that Miss Minutes was talking about in the presentation, the tutorials and stuff. That this is the moment where everything goes crazy. Like, we thought it would be Wanda. We thought it could possibly be Doctor Strange, but no, this is it. So this is the moment where it's really going to start tying into Doctor Strange 2, which I'm really excited for. And now as Lady Loki escapes, we see our Loki jump in the portal with her. So I don't know if they're now teaming up or he just escaped elsewhere and he's going to go into hiding. I don't know what his plan is, but it was interesting to see his motivation throughout this episode. Honestly, I think this was a really fun episode. It also had a lot to think about. Mobius and Loki do have some very heavy conversations about the meaning of life and what the timeline really means, and I thought that stuff was really good. The metaphors about the apocalypse was really funny. And again, there's just a lot of buddy cop procedural stuff, which I think is really cool. Again, I think Marvel is really knocking it out of the park here. And I think the pacing is really good because I wasn't expecting to see Lady Loki until like closer to the end, but I'm happy they showed her now, which means that there's a lot crazier things that are probably going to happen because we have 4 more episodes left. So I am really excited. I am really wondering what's going on. I think there's more to the TVA than they're letting on. I think the motivation for the Timekeepers to not want a multiverse, I think that's something deeper. I think there's more to it than that, than they're letting on, for sure. And that certain people know more, like Renslayer, I think knows more than she's letting on. So I am interested to see how this all wraps up and where this is all going. But I do think this is definitely going to be one of the most impactful moments in the MCU, for sure, especially in Phase 4 as we're getting into Spider-Man and Multiverse of Madness. So I am really excited to see where this is going. What did you think of this episode of Loki? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.